Hello and welcome to Auto Shenanigans. How the devil are you? Have you had a good week? My name is John and thank you very much for joining me for another exciting episode of Secrets of the Motorway. In this week's episode, we're going to be tackling a big one, the M4. Covering a distance of 189 miles, it starts here at West London in Chiswick and heads all the way down to Pont Abraham near Llanelli. That's in Wales. But we've a long way to go before we get there. Junction 1 is where the North Circular and South Circular roads meet the A4, and it's here that the M4 started its life as the Chiswick flyover. The Chiswick flyover was constructed in 1959 with the aim of reducing congestion in the area and to help reduce the traffic loads on the local roads. The first stretch of the flyover ran for around half a mile, following the route of the A4, creating a rather unique double-tier road. In the early 1960s, it was extended by 1.5 miles, but by 1965 had become part of the M4. Now, the Chiswick flyover was never actually built as a motorway. They turned it into the M4 merely because it made most sense. As a result, the starting section of the M4 is really a glorified dual carriageway, but it hasn't got any hard shoulders and there's a 40-mile-an-hour speed limit. And that might be the lowest speed limit imposed on any motorway. I'm not really sure, I probably just made that up, to be fair. I have to say, whilst the traffic is a complete arse in this area, I quite enjoy the drive out of London along the M4. Firstly, you're heading out of London, and secondly, the M4 snakes its way through a bit of a built-up area with lots of buildings on either side, and it makes me feel like I'm driving in a game of Need for Speed or something like that. Sadly, in the real world, there's absolutely no chance of any speed on the M4 in this part of London. If you are heading into London between junctions 3 and 2, you'll notice lots of patches of red tarmac on the carriageway. This is the remains of the infamous M4 bus lane that was installed in 1999. Apparently, it was a good idea to make an already busy road even worse by removing one of the lanes to usual traffic and only allowing buses and taxis and the like down it. What made it more stupid was its position in lane 3, so the slow-moving buses would join the motorway, cross all of the lanes into lane 3, and then a short distance later have to cross back over those lanes to exit the motorway. When it first opened, off-peak travel times increased due to the imposed 50-mile-an-hour speed limit. However, to be fair, during rush hour, it reduced your journey times by 1 whole minute. Totally worth the expense. A couple of years after opening, they increased the speed limit from 50 to 60 miles per hour, and this speed limit still remains in place today, despite the fact they've removed the bus lane altogether. At Junction 4, we find the Heathrow spur and more exciting bus lane trivia. For you see, it was on this spur road that the first M4 bus lane was installed back in 1997. When they built it, they also put in an additional lane, so there was no loss of space to the traffic. Absolutely genius, and it's still in place today because presumably it works really well. You'd think that they'd carry over this sensible thinking when they installed the bus lane on the main parts of the M4, but nope. Junction 4B, or the Thorney interchange, is where the M4 and the M25 meet in what's known as a 4-stack interchange. There are only 3 of these 4-stack interchanges to be found across the entire motorway network. We've already seen one of them in our M23 video. This makes number 2, leaving just one more to find. The Thorney interchange was constructed in the 1980s when the M25 came along, and if you're wondering why there's no lovely drone footage, it's because Heathrow. We can't fly anything around here. Along the course of the M4, particularly between junctions 3 and 9, using Google Maps you'll spot various works going on, and this is down to the M4's upgrade to smart motorway status. The majority of the smart motorway upgrades have now been completed on the M4. It was all scheduled to be done by spring 2022, and for the most part it has indeed been finished. Next up is Junction 8. Except it isn't. Junction 8 was removed when the A308M came about, and you can learn all about that in this video that we did here. But in short, when the A308M and M4 interchange was built, Junction 8 was closed because it sat too close to the new interchange and wasn't the most safe of arrangements. They then decided that as there's no longer a Junction 8, they'd combine it with Junction 9, giving us the rather oddly numbered Junction 8/9. This is the only example you'll find of a junction like this on any of our motorways. Just before you get to Junction 10, you'll pass a work site and secret junction that was built in 2018 to serve as the main base for the M4 smart motorway upgrades. At the time, it was one of the largest sites of its type. However, I'm sure these days the HS2 guys would have something to say about that. When it was operational, it housed 900 workers and all the crap they needed to upgrade the M4 to a smart motorway. Upgrade. These days, the site is a lot smaller than it was because the majority of the motorway works have now pretty much neared completion, and it's just not needed now. I don't know what they're going to do with the slip roads. Maybe they'll remove them completely. Perhaps they'll leave them in place as a set of ghost slip roads for us to enjoy at a later date. Junction 10 is where the A329M and the M40 meet at the Winnersh interchange. This interchange looks rather excessive, and it is really, but it was built with other things in mind. Around the same time they were planning the London Ringways project, they were drawing up ideas for a motorway that would link the M3 and the M4 and the M25. It would have been called the M31, and the Winnersh interchange was built to allow the M31 to pass through on its way to the M25. Had it been built, you'd have been able to avoid the notorious M4-M25 junction at Heathrow by exiting the M25 at junction 10, heading up the M31 and picking up the M4 just by Reading. Keep an eye out for this bridge when you're driving between junctions 10 and 11. It now carries an abandoned road across the M4. When the M4 was built, most of this area was still open countryside, but when the developers expanded the nearby town of Ely, they rerouted and redesigned a lot of the roads, leaving this small section of abandoned road that can now be explored on foot. We've come up a few junctions and we're near Welford, which is between junctions 13 and 14. It's here that we find the most well-known, not very secret junction. Originally a World War II airfield, RAF Welford closed in 1946, but then reopened in 1955 due to the Cold War as a United States Air Force munitions depot. They do have a conventional entrance, but the motorway junction was put in place to allow access for the heavier and larger vehicles. Today, it's one of the largest munition storage sites in Western Europe. It's time for a coffee break, so we've stopped at Membry Services, which sits between junctions 14 and 15. Continuing with the RAF sort of theme, if you take a little walk up the bank at Membry, you'll be met with the sight of a very small airfield. RAF Membry opened in 1942 and was operated as a joint effort between the RAF and the United States Air Force. When the war ended, it continued operations as a private airport, but when the M4 came along in the 1960s, the airport was closed. The motorway and services were built on parts of the old airfield. However, what's left of the old airfield is still in use today by light aircraft and microlights. Over the road from the services, and you can't really miss it, is the 500-foot high Membry transmitter. It was built in 1965 to broadcast ITV signals across the South Midlands, transmitting as far as Oxford. This service came to an end in 1985 and the transmitter sat unused for 10 years before the BBC added a radio transmitter to boost the signal of their national stations. Today, these are still transmitting along with various mobile networks and DAB signals. Just after junction 15, you'll drive under what the locals call Curly Wurly Bridge. This is a wonderful example of what can be done with a bit of concrete, and I'm sure the Concrete Society hold it in high regard. It's a pedestrian footbridge that's got spiral footpaths, and I think it's absolutely brilliant. I couldn't find much of an explanation as to how and why it was built, but I assume it was built around the same time as the M4. If you follow the footpath north from the Curly Wurly Bridge, you'll reach the Coatwater Country Park. It started out as a 70-acre reservoir built in 1822, but it wasn't until 1914 that it became a country park for pleasure. Back then, you were allowed to swim in the lake, and in the 1930s they constructed this rather fabulous Art Deco design diving board. It's been awarded Grade 2 listed status, and at a cost of £100,000 was restored earlier this year by the local council. You'll also find here the North Wiltshire Model Engineering Society and their 1-mile narrow gauge railway. Onwards we go, and between junctions 18 and 19 is where you'll find a set of ghost slip roads. When they were building the M4, the plan was to build a service station here, so the Ministry of Transport purchased the 16-acre site and installed the slip roads. Following that, they just held onto the site for a while and never really made any solid decisions as to what to do with it. Nothing, it turns out. Just up the road from our ghost slip roads and poking through the trees is a brick chimney. Blink and you'll miss it, but I can assure you it is there. Built in around 1851, this colliery and mine worked in conjunction with the nearby Brandy Bottom pit, increasing its ventilation and output. The two sites are linked via underground tunnels. Alongside the mine lies an abandoned railway. However, if you follow it under the M4, it very quickly becomes not an abandoned railway, as you find the Westerly Fuel Depot, which was opened by Merco Petrol. It was built in around 1990 and sits next to the Avon County Waste Terminal, which at the time was sat just off the Midland Railway route to Bath. The depot is still in use today, but the railway comes down here and ends at 2 buffer stops right underneath the M4. It's unlikely that trains would come down this section of the track, however if they did it would simply be to access the depot. The waste terminal is no longer in use from what I understand, and dotted around the site are various sidings and branch lines that seem to be getting hidden in the undergrowth. At one point it was used as a training facility for Network Rail, however it's not clear if that's still the case. At junction 21, The M4 used to take a different route and follow today's M48. After construction of the Severn River crossing in 1996, they built the link from junction 21 to 22 as we know it today. The old M4 became the M48 and the new M4 is the new M4. The new crossing they built is known as the Prince of Wales Bridge. As I mentioned, it opened in 1996 and was designed to supplement the traffic capacity of the first river crossing built in 1966. The Prince of Wales Bridge is over 3 miles long and until 2018 operated as a toll bridge. You'd have been paying £6.70 to drive your standard car over the bridge in 2017, and anything over 3.5 tonnes would have been £20. Happily, these tolls no longer exist, so you're free to drive over into Wales. If you really want to. We're not going to be doing that today, and as you can see, we've run out of daylight. So this is where we find our journey's end. So you'll have to join us next week for part 2 of the M4, where we'll be crossing over the water and seeing what Wales's one main motorway has to offer. That's all we've got time for then this week, guys. I hope you liked the video. If you did, there's a button specifically for that. And I'm still on a mission to reach 100,000 subscribers, so if you haven't already, please do consider subscribing to the channel. That'll be wicked sweet awesome. Enjoy the rest of your week, whatever it is you get up to. My name's John, you've been watching Auto Shenanigans, and I'll see you guys next time for another exciting episode of Secrets of the Motorway. Take care. See ya. Bye-bye.